There is a material so simple, so cheap, and so effective that once you understand what it does, you will start to question why you have ever spent money on waterproof sprays, expensive outdoor gear, or products that promise protection but quietly fail over time. Because right now, sitting in your home, or one store away, is a compound that has been trusted across centuries, across continents, across the harshest environments on Earth, and yet somehow has been reduced to a forgotten technique that most people never even consider. Not because it stopped working, but because it never needed to be replaced in the first place. And that alone makes it a problem for any system built on repeat purchases, because what you are about to understand is not just a way to waterproof fabric, leather, or wood. It is a completely different way of thinking about durability, about protection, and about why some solutions last while others quietly fade away. Because water damage is not just an inconvenience. It is one of the oldest and most persistent challenges humans have faced from the moment we started building shelters, crafting clothing, and carrying supplies across unpredictable environments. Water has always been the force that breaks things down, that rots fibers, weakens structures, and slowly destroys materials that were never designed to resist it. And yet long before chemical coatings, synthetic membranes, or branded performance gear existed, people had already found a way to solve this problem, using nothing more than what they could gather, process, and understand through observation. Because when you look back at how early civilizations survived in environments where failure meant death, you begin to see a pattern that repeats itself again and again. They did not rely on complex systems. They relied on simple principles applied correctly, consistently, and with a deep understanding of how materials behave under stress. And this is where beeswax and resin enter the story, not as a modern discovery, but as a rediscovery of something that never actually left. Because across history, whether it was Viking shipbuilders sealing the hulls of vessels that would cross freezing oceans, or monks preserving fragile documents through seasons of relentless humidity, or hunters protecting essential gear in climates where exposure meant survival or death, the same principle kept appearing in different forms. Natural waxes and resins create a barrier that water cannot penetrate, not temporarily, not partially, but in a way that fundamentally changes how a surface interacts with moisture. And the reason this works is not magic. It is physics at the molecular level, because water behaves in a very specific way depending on the surface it touches. It either spreads out and absorbs into the material, or it pulls together and forms droplets that roll away. And that behavior is controlled by something called surface energy, a concept that sounds technical but is actually very simple in practice. Materials like cotton, canvas, and untreated leather have high surface energy, which means water is naturally drawn into them, filling the spaces between fibers, soaking through, and eventually weakening the structure. But when you apply a substance like beeswax, you are lowering that surface energy to a point where water can no longer spread. It loses its ability to penetrate, and instead it beads up and falls away. And this is where the transformation happens, because you are not just coating the surface, you are changing how the material interacts with its environment. And when resin is added into the mixture, something even more important happens. The compound becomes more stable, more flexible, and more capable of bonding with the fibers themselves, creating a layer that moves with the material instead of cracking or peeling off under stress. And this combination, wax for water resistance and resin for structural integrity, is what allows the effect to last, not just through one use, but through repeated exposure, bending, and wear. And this is why when you compare it to many modern treatments, the difference becomes clear, because synthetic coatings often sit on top of the material, providing immediate results that degrade over time as the coating breaks down, washes away, or loses its effectiveness, requiring reapplication to maintain performance. And that cycle, apply, degrade, reapply, has become so normalized that most people no longer question it. They accept it as part of the process, as the cost of maintaining gear, clothing, and materials that are exposed to the elements. But when you step back and look at it from a different angle, you begin to see that this cycle is not necessarily a requirement. It is a design choice, a way of solving the problem that prioritizes repeat use over long-term stability. And once you realize that, The idea of a solution that does not require constant renewal starts to feel almost unfamiliar, even though it has existed for centuries. And this is where the conversation shifts from what works to why certain things are more visible than others, because in a world where products are designed to be replaced, improved, or upgraded, something that continues to work without needing to be bought again does not stand out. It does not create demand, it does not generate attention. And over time, it fades into the background. Not because it lacks value, but because it does not align with the systems that drive visibility and distribution. And yet, despite that, it continues to exist, passed down through individuals, rediscovered by communities, and proven again and again by people who are willing to test it for themselves. And what they find is not a perfect solution that solves every problem instantly, but a reliable method that performs consistently, that holds up under real conditions, and that offers something most modern alternatives do not: durability that extends beyond the moment of application. And this is where the practical side becomes important, because understanding the principle is one thing, but applying it correctly is what determines the outcome. And while the process itself is straightforward, it requires attention to how the material is treated, because simply rubbing wax onto a surface without allowing it to properly integrate into the fibers will not produce the same result as taking the time to heat it, to work it in, and to ensure that it becomes part of the material rather than just sitting on top of it. And this step, this integration, is what creates the difference between temporary resistance and long-term protection. Because once the compound is embedded within the structure, it is no longer easily removed by water, friction, or normal use. It becomes part of the system, functioning as a barrier that continues to perform without constant maintenance. And over time, as the material is used, exposed, and tested, the stability of that barrier becomes more apparent, because instead of gradually losing effectiveness, it maintains its function, requiring only occasional reinforcement rather than complete reapplication. And this shift, from constant renewal to occasional maintenance, is what changes the entire experience, because instead of worrying about when something will fail, you begin to trust that it will hold, that it will perform when needed. And that trust is not based on branding or marketing, but on repeated observation, on seeing the same result under different conditions, and recognizing that the underlying mechanism does not change. Because water will always behave according to the same physical principles, and a surface treated to resist it will always respond in the same way, regardless of whether that surface was treated with a modern chemical spray or a simple mixture of natural wax and resin. And that realization carries a kind of clarity that extends beyond the immediate use case, because it highlights a broader pattern: the difference between solutions that are designed to perform once and solutions that are designed to last. And when you begin to look at other areas of daily life through that lens, you start to notice how often the former is prioritized over the latter, how often convenience and speed take precedence over durability and resilience, and how that choice shapes the way we interact with the things we use, the environments we move through, and the systems we depend on. And this is where the deeper value of something like this becomes clear. Not just as a method for waterproofing, but as an example of how simple, well-understood principles can create results that are both effective and sustainable when they are applied with intention. And that does not mean abandoning modern technology or rejecting new developments. It means recognizing that not every improvement comes from increasing complexity, and that sometimes the most reliable solutions are the ones that have already been tested across time, across conditions, and across generations. Because they are based on fundamentals that do not change, and when you combine that understanding with practical application, you create something that is not only useful in the moment, but continues to provide value over time, reducing the need for constant replacement, reducing the dependency on external inputs, and ultimately creating a more stable and predictable outcome. And that is what makes this more than just a technique. It makes it a shift in perspective, a way of approaching problems that prioritizes longevity over immediacy, stability over repetition, and understanding over assumption. And once you begin to see that clearly, you realize that the true advantage is not in having access to more products, but in knowing which ones you no longer need. And that knowledge, once understood, has a way of changing how you approach not just one problem, but many. Because it reminds you that sometimes the most effective solution is not the one that is most visible, but the one that has been quietly working all along. And this is where the human element becomes even more powerful. Because behind every soaked tent, every ruined pair of boots, every jacket that failed halfway through a storm, there is a moment where reliability mattered, where protection was not just about comfort but about safety, about staying dry in conditions where exposure could lead to real consequences. And when you begin to trust a solution that holds under those conditions, that does not require constant reapplication or last-minute fixes, it changes the way you prepare, the way you move, and the confidence you carry into environments that are inherently unpredictable. And that confidence is not something that can be easily quantified or marketed, but it is something that becomes very real when you are standing in the rain, miles away from shelter, relying on the gear you prepared beforehand, and knowing that it will perform exactly as expected because it is built on a principle that does not change, a barrier that water cannot cross, a surface that refuses to absorb, and a method that has already been tested not just by you, but by countless others across time who faced the same challenge and arrived at the same solution. And that continuity, that shared understanding across generations, is what gives this approach its strength. Because it is not based on trends or temporary innovations. It is based on something far more stable, the consistent behavior of materials and the predictable response of water. And once you align with that, once you stop fighting against those principles and start working with them, the results become not only more effective, but more dependable. And in a world where so many solutions are designed to be temporary, that kind of dependability is not just useful, it is rare. And once you experience it, it becomes very difficult to go back to anything else.